Nuts and May is an ode to experience and to the complexities of the lives we live. From growing up to mental health, from generational differences to life and loss. It is a chronicle of the experiences of the multifaceted characters in Jeremy Niebuhr's book. I'm lucky enough to speak to Jeremy Niebuhr today. Jeremy Niebuhr was educated at Harrow School and Oriel College, Oxford. After a period practicing as a member of the bar in King's Bench Walk, he was then admitted as a solicitor and becoming a partner in 2 city law firms. He specialized in corporate work, including mergers and acquisitions, capital market public offerings, private equity transactions, and commercial law. He still acts for a few long-standing clients. Jeremy, it's terrific to speak to you.
Very kind of you to ask me. Very kind indeed.
So I guess just to start, Jeremy, Nuts and May is a combination of short stories written by you. Tell me, how did Nuts and May start?
I wanted to write a letter to a very dear friend of mine at Oxford. I didn't have very many friends when I was at Oxford, but this person I was liked very, very much indeed. He was a chap called Paul Thompson, and he was extremely kind to me. He also taught me a lot. He introduced me to modern classical music such as it is. He introduced me to English watercolors. His mother had a very distinguished gallery. And he introduced me to French Bordeaux claret, which I've benefited from ever since. But he died when he was 40 of a brain tumor. It was he who looked after me when I went into this terrible vortex of depression in my last year at Oxford. So I wanted to write a letter to him, telling him how everything had worked out after I'd left university, left the Warnford Hospital, where I was in an outpatients, but it was an undergraduate ward, really. It was an undergraduate ward. Ladies upstairs and gentlemen undergraduates downstairs, or the other way around. And so I wrote this as a long letter to him, and it developed into a book. And I turned myself into somebody who'd done quite well in the world of art and related things. And it was an interview by, I turned it into an interview by a very skeptical and slightly aggressive columnist from the New Statesman. That's how it started. But when I'd done that, I thought of a lot of other things where suffering has led to a kind of resolution and a consolation for the people who've gone through it, and particularly for young children who've found themselves unable to deal with things that happened to them when they were young, or that they saw, or that they experienced, and how they got over these things and in their life. And I went, one story led to another, really. So a lot of them about children's experiences, but they're all about a kind of blessing, an absolution, a redemption, coming together of a knowledge that it's all right. And that's what I wanted to convey, really.
So it's almost, as it were, acknowledging the existence of a lot of childhood trauma of a lot of your characters.
Yes.
But still being able to overcome it so many years later.
Yes, you see, bottom line is one of the stories, and he surmounts bullying at school, which so many children have to go through. Some people don't manage it. Sometimes you get to bullying later in life, but it's best to have your bullies in early youth and deal with them, because they don't come back. And the bully I had at school, they certainly didn't come back. And then What's the Point, which is a funny story. What's the Point is about a chap who bursts into life, and but by the end of his life, a bit of suffering and loss, he gets to the stage when he doesn't want to take anything from nature, and he's content just to know it's there, that it doesn't have to grasp everything. He starts his reaction to life is to grasp and to defeat, because he didn't come from a particularly privileged background, and he was mobbed at school, but he was a very powerful character, and he goes through life as a very powerful character, and it does him some good, but it isn't suffering. His suffering opens up a completely new understanding, and I think that's the message of really almost all these stories, is all of them, I think, really, suffering leading to a kind of acceptance, not in the sense of saying, oh, well, you know, I've got to put up with it. Not that at all. A kind of non-resistance, going through suffering and coming out the other side, wiser, more complete, and with less of an opinion of yourself.
So it's more of sort of acknowledging the past, and also accepting the pain of a lot of people, and I guess a lot of people might indeed relate to that. I guess on the slightly lighter note, I then asked the question: if you had to describe Nuts and May in one word, all those short stories, what would it be?
I think it's the creative impulse in us is never suppressed by suffering and is often released by it. It's a relationship that suffering and the creative impulse can live quite well together. And indeed, I think if one goes through suffering without, in a strange say, suffering from the suffering, if one accepts it and goes through it and doesn't resist it, then your life becomes much fuller, and you see things that you wouldn't have seen before. And I think the creative impulse is so strong in human beings that I wanted to show that it isn't impeded by suffering. In fact, suffering renders that more and more important. That's about really what I was trying to say.
So it's almost that the sort of the suffering.
But I think that, I think that suffering is actually very important for everyone, really, in some ways. We try to avoid it, and that's what is the real suffering. When you stop trying to avoid it and accept it, then something very new emerges. It's impossible to describe, but a composure arises. I remember when I was very depressed, I was about to take my final on the schools, and which goes on for 5 days, two big papers each morning and the afternoon, and it was quite a challenge. Looking around Christchurch Meadows on my own, and I suddenly felt a complete release. You know, I felt I thought everything fell away, even my fears, everything. I just felt that I could let go of all this apprehension, and I did. And I went to see a chap who was in a more serious ward than I was. He was an American poor fellow, heavy on drugs. I don't mean drugs like we talk about him, medical drugs. And I sat with him for about half an hour. And his psychiatrist told me afterwards that it was that made it possible for him to sit his exam. And he did get some sort of degree. And so, you know, it is possible to let one's suffering go. It is possible. And not to fight it, not to resist it. And I learned that with my experience of depression then. I've had it all my life, comes and goes, but I've been on medication very successfully for the last 15, 18 years, and doesn't really bother me anymore. I just think it's very common. And people feel diminished by it. They feel less than they should be. They feel they're imposters, as I think. You know, it's very hard because your personality just disappears.
So I guess you could almost say that it's on one hand saying that struggle and suffering really does make you. We all try to avoid it, but struggling, it's where a lot of the creativity and passion in our life and purpose that we find in our lives comes from. But
yes.
Yeah, on the other hand, it's saying that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for those out there who are going through.
You mustn't run away from suffering. You must open yourself to it completely, because there's suffering, and then minding about the suffering. I know it sounds a bit odd, but that was my experience. And once you let go of the minding about the suffering, a new world emerges.
Yes, and of course that's a lot of what a lot of your stories talk about. We look at
I suppose they must.
Yeah, yes, there's a great variety of themes that you touch upon, and such as friendship, of course, in The Birthday Treat, or mental health in Nuts and May, and which are all particularly pertinent themes today, especially amongst younger people. What would you say to younger people about the experiences you're depicting here in these stories as a whole?
Well, I think children are, I say younger people, let's call them younger people, are far more able to cope with shocks of upbringing, and goodness knows most people have them, than we think. The children can be very extraordinarily perceptive, but there are times when there are things that they simply can't cope with when they're very young, you know. And there's no easy way to make that all right for them. I'm not sure that finding explanations for everything is the way. What I think is the way, if it's any message at all, is to see how one is disturbed by the things that happened in your being brought up, or what you met during your upbringing, not necessarily from your parents, but just through the whole process of growing up, is to see it very clearly. That's the first thing. Really perceive it for what it really is, and then open yourself to it and accept it fully. Don't run away from it. And that way, the giant gets smaller. The closer you get to the horrible giant, the smaller he gets. When you get really close to him, he disappears. And that's what I suppose, that's as much as I can really say about it. I don't think you can think your way out of it. Because where do you start? In the end, you start with the Big Bang. You have to see it first and then accept it. And of course, there comes a time when you're an old man and you think, God, I could have had led a more useful life. But yeah. Yes.
I guess
the birthday treat was an interesting one that you mentioned. I made talk about that because they both suffer. These two chaps. The fun of that expectation. That's what I wanted to emphasize. How expectation almost always disappoints. Almost always. And expectation is a way in which we forecast the future according to the past. And of course, it's a fool's game because you can't. And expectation, always. But these two guys, they did suffer, both of them differently, and they've come through it. And when they realize, one and the other, they've both given each other presents, which they can't enjoy because one's given tickets for the opera and he's half deaf. The other one's given tickets for a very special shoot down in Tollard Royal, but he's in a wheelchair. And because they realize, and because they have their suffering enables them to laugh because, you know, they've opened up a part of themselves. So I think it's rather a good story, that one.
Almost a liberation in the way, sort of self.
Yeah.
Mocking themselves.
It's terribly funny. They sit down, they both realize that what they bought the other person, they can't use. And before they've even opened it, before they even told each other, they're both laughing.
Listen, of course, there's a much greater story to that. Hopefully we don't spoil that for readers.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
There's a lot more to the story, I can assure viewers.
Yes.
I guess reading a lot of these short stories, there's clearly a lot of authenticity in them. And I guess, do you think it's important for writers to bring some authenticity and some of their own personal experiences to their stories?
I don't think you could claim to be any more than a storyteller if that doesn't happen. I mean, there are three levels, I suppose, of stories. At the bottom level, there's the stories about people, just about what goes on, you know, which is a sort of gossip column story type. Then there's the story about events, which is Grisham, John Grisham type story. Mm-hmm. Nothing wrong with that. But it stays resolutely at the surface. And then there's a story about people and events, which penetrates the world of ideas and perception, and then that is my judgment. That's a proper story. That's a full deal. I don't think that many publishers publish that sort of stuff anymore. You know, all they're interested in is cookery books and what sells and so on. And I'm nothing wrong with that, but God almighty. I mean, I respect enormously Somerset Maugham's skill in stories. I find Graham Greene is a very good writer, but Power and the Glory is very good. He does go below the surface, but it's a very negative view, which I don't think is actually true. I don't think the human spirit is like that at all.
Yes, a lot of his stories tend to be laced with a great deal of pessimism.
Yes, it's very well written. The perception is extraordinary. And Roald Dahl is too quirky. It's very funny, but he resists the depth of his own perception, which he's clearly got. And some of the stories are very amusing, but they're almost spiteful. I can't really think of an author who really does go really deeply below the surface and is at the same time consoling and ready to say that there is an absolution redemption for everyone, whatever's happened. And that's what I suppose was trying to say, because that's my firm belief. Yes. Yes, sorry, yes. Carry on. I'm so sorry, getting carried away here.
It's all right. I guess that's sort of taking a very different track, as you say, writers that cover a very different theme about the question, the darkness that resides in the human soul. And
yes,
of course we read that in John le Carré as well. As in Green, as you mentioned, there's a lot of self-questioning and self-doubt that a lot of the main characters are almost filled with.
I don't think that you find that in Dickens. Dickens certainly, there is in some of his works a great consolation. Less so in Hardy, much less so in Hardy. I don't believe that the dark night of the soul and so on is, I mean, of course we all have these dark periods, but that is only a means of recognizing light, and it's the light that's ever there. It's an extraordinary thing that light, the darkness depends on light, and it's not an alternative. That is the only constant, and I'm sure that's true. But that's my view. I think that I think the lessons are that the stories, if they have any, is to give hope and confidence, and hopefully a sense of joy.
Yes, indeed. And I certainly hope so. So I guess the short story that is the centerpiece of this series is the namesake, Nuts in May. And here you describe your own experiences. I guess this is the letter you were mentioning earlier.
Yes.
Where you describe your own experiences and your own upbringing, moving to Liverpool from South Africa, winning a scholarship to Oxford as a member of Oriel College, and then in your slipping down unknowingly into the chasm of depression. It takes a great deal of bravery, really, to write about this and bring this very intimate, personal topic of mental health up. How important was it, do you think, to tell this very personal story to readers?
Well, it was easier for me because Paul saw that at first hand. So I was describing to him something that he would have witnessed. So it was easier. I don't think I would have made a public statement about it without that very easily. But what holds you back from doing that is you're not wanting to promote your success or personality, because when you have depression removes your personality. Your persona is dissolved, and that's why people sort of feel they're imposters, and you do get that feeling that you're useless, because what you've always believed in, what you've identified with, your persona, has evaporated, has gone. So you're literally in a vacuum. As I describe it, it's like an abyss. You're down in an abyss, and above you, the world is going on. And that's quite hard. But one of the best lessons of life is not to trust your persona, not when it's elated, not when it's depressed. It's one of the great philosophical lessons, is that we should dissolve our persona where we're able to. And so I felt I should say something, because that, I think, is of fundamental and enduring value, that people must realize that to be happy, they have to cease to be what they think they are and exist in a state of being rather than of thinking. Then I think everything comes clear. In another way, it's another form of acceptance, And depression, you can only get through it if you accept it. And after all, it's quite a good discipline not believing your feelings. And the way through is duty. Duty and love. Duty is the way through. When you are feeling you just can't do your teeth, let alone go past the office reception area because you feel so terrible to get to your room, which I had regularly for years, the only way that will get you past it is duty. You've got to be there at 8:30, you've got clients, boom, duty. So you're pulled by the sense of duty. And, God bless it. If we live by duty and love, nothing much will go wrong. But that's the way through.
One of the other themes that you touched upon in Nuts in May, talking about your time at Oxford, was the sense that your ability, as you said, wasn't what others perceived it to be. And I guess that there are a great deal of people reading this who relate to this, the idea of sort of imposter syndrome, the sense of imposter syndrome. And what would you say to them about what they're going through?
Well, it's a form of acute self-doubt. It does affect your thinking very badly, because You know, even today, I think the examiners were just being kind to me in giving me an interview, which was for a first. I got four or five alphas in my exams, but I honestly thought that they were doing that to be nice to me because I was in the Warmbutt. I still have a sense of that even now, 60 years later. And that's how bad it gets. You know, I'm worthless, you know. And the way through that is to abandon altogether thoughts of yourself and return to what is actually present here now. You know, I mean, I started to read law. I became a lawyer, but I did it when I was in the Warmbutt Hospital. There was a room where I could use, and I got hold of Anson on the law of contract. And, you know, I thought, well, I'm never going to do this, but I've got the book and, you know, I better open it. And I opened it and I started to read it, and it was quite interesting. And then page by page, you know, that's all there was. That's all there was. And I went back to the Warmbutt, my Ward 5. I didn't have enough money to go out much. I had enough to go to the local pub once a week with 2 or 3 others. And so step by step, through the pages of Anson's Law of Contract, I gradually came in touch with myself again. But it wasn't the self of Oxford. It wasn't the self of playing cricket at Lord's, as I did. It wasn't the self of being president of the dining club, which I was, or the art club, which I was, or of having got a scholarship, which I did, of being a character, witty, all the rest. All that had gone. All that had gone. And took a long time, really. I don't think one ever really reclaims one's personality. I'm glad I didn't. But that's really the message. It's self-doubt, and the way through it is not thinking. Is thought revolves around your idea of yourself. Don't trust it. Don't trust it. Of course, you need to have thought to work out what train to get to London and what, you know, how you're going to, have you got enough money to pay for it, and that sort of thing. But when you're thinking loosely, you're thinking about yourself fundamentally, and that is dangerous for someone with depression. You've got to be very practical. I'm doing my teeth. I can actually feel myself doing my teeth. I'm not thinking about what I'm going to do. How am I going to get on the train? How will I manage the office? I'm doing my teeth. That is the way through.
So managing the simple things step by step, and knowing that you've got a greater obligation.
Doing the quite correct. Doing the simple things that you have to do very well. And that's not difficult when you're doing your teeth or reading a book or anything. And that's what I'd like to, that's what I've tried to convey in the dialogue of Nuts and May, because May Davison was the most distinguished psychologist in the country. Yet she devoted her life to us undergraduates. She became the president of the British Psychological Association. She was regarded as a saint by the dons of Oxford, and indeed she was. I mean, we owed our sanity to her. She was just remarkable. You know, I'm quite moved when I think about it now. Maybe we better move on.
Yes, and we revert back to Miss Siddons, the first story in your book, and now this one looks at a very different context, and
yes,
and is on a much a very different note, and it takes a very different form. And this is more, from my perspective, it's more a reflection of sorts, and it takes place over the course of a woman's journey from the Kenyan highlands to the Surrey hills. Yes. And it's a journey that takes us from her life in Clitheroe to her finding this painting in her home in Surrey. So take us through the message you're trying to convey here, as it seems to touch upon a great deal of important themes.
Well, you're very perceptive. That's very good of you to say that. I'm glad you've seen that. I was hoping that would happen. She is a lady of Edwardian, basically Edwardian ideas, you know, the late Victorian period. And she's been brought up in Kenya during the colonial period. Her father was a tea planter or coffee planter, whatever it was. And she's related to the famous Mrs. Siddons from the early 19th century. And of course, the story is partly about relinquishing the past, the relinquishing of the colonial element of Kenya, which happens, of course, in her lifetime, and the relinquishing of the whole of the sort of relative of Mrs. Siddons, privileged background, you know, country house in Surrey and all that, because she lives in relative poverty most of her life, running a kindergarten, which she'd founded with her twin sister in Kenya. And so you have this relinquishment of status and colonialism being replaced or succeeded by fundamentally a mixture of duty and love, because she gets enormous love from her parents, the Kenyan parents, for what she does for the children. Enormous gratitude. And also Millie, her helper, is devoted to them. And her twin sister, when she dies, is a very touching story. How, well, I won't spoil it for you. Very touching story. And when it all comes right, she finds this painting in the attic, and it proves to be very, very much more valuable than the family had believed. And it's quite genuine, actually. That is part of a true story. And it enables her, I don't say it, but you can see at the end, she knows she's going to go back to the Kenyan Hills with Millie. And it's a moment of immense release and consolation, gratitude, a kind of blessing on a life very well lived, returning to what she truly loves, irrespective of her past. That's what that is supposed to be about. Perhaps I'm making too much of it. I don't know. I mean, it's what I thought.
It felt like it's sort of the feeling that one has when you feel that the universe is folding on you, page is turning, and that there's a new page in your life, a new chapter in your life, but it's blank, and you're not really sure what to write. And of course, there was a sense of loss, and it touches upon the sense of loss, and it's a great deal that I wouldn't want to spoil it for readers.
You put it very well when you say the page is turning. That's true. And there's Kenyan people. That's just, you know, lovely. I mean, of course they've had that, you know, people in government who corrupt and goodness knows what. I don't know whatever, but that doesn't affect the people. No, it's really lovely, really lovely. Funnily enough, it's that part of it is drawn from somebody I knew very, very well, he's much older than me. He was a coffee planter in the Clitheroe Hills in the highlands, you know, before the war, and Lord Chesham's estates, and I made the owner of the estates, Lord Amersham. it's on the Metropolitan line with Chesham, so I chose Amersham. Anyway, yes, I'm sorry, I've gone on too.
That makes sense. Makes sense. Your last short story, 40 Years On, is of course a reference to the Harrow main school song, which also happens to be an Alan Bennett play.
I didn't know that.
Oh yeah, it was named after the school song, I believe. So it's about a cricket match at the Clitheroe cricket club, and the different memories and recollections that arise as the match progresses. A lot of the complex ideas, and it's able to pack it in over the course of a cricket match. The narrator is on the visitor side, I believe, and the players range from anything from a retired Old Bailey judge to a 12-year-old practical pupil. And I guess reading it, what do you think? Why did you pick the topic of change between generations, and recalling the past for this story?
That's very good. I mean, there's a wonderful line in 40 Years On, which talks about, oh, the great days in the distance enchanted. What a lovely line that is. But I set this story in a cricket match because I wanted to convey the whole notion that life is actually a play. There is no point to it except that it is a play, and we have to play fully and take part in it fully to the extent of our capacities and potential. But it is fundamentally a play. There is no point. There's no point, because if there's a point, it's something you have to reach. And the secret of life is that it is not in the future, much less in the past. It's now. And so it is a play. The Sanskrit word for this is called Leela. It's a lovely word. It's often used as a Christian name, Leela, from which we get the word ludicrous. The play, ludo, is a Roman Latin, and so this is a story of the whole gamut of life, seen as a kind of cross-section, from children to dogs and, babies and the thing, right the way up to the old boys, right through all the changing scenes of life in trouble and in joy. Yeah, all that. And it's all seen in one play, it's a cricket match. Shakespeare talks about it, it's all the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players. And that's what it was supposed to be. And of course, it's very beautiful. It's certainly a very beautiful place. And it's based on Surrey cricket ground, which is incredibly beautiful. And you look over this lovely, lovely village, this beautiful tower, church, and it's just lovely. And so you move from one life to another life, as expressed by the people who were introduced in another life. And at the end, there's the scorer, who's a lady, and she experiences the distance enchanted, and it's a lovely ending. It's just lovely, because life is an enchanted place if it's looked at as a play. Anyway, that was what that was about.
Well, that's much deeper than even when I initially read it. I mean, it really does cover a whole span of questions that might arise with us as we read on.
It sounds like a philosophical lecture rather than a book.
So,
but it's not. It's great fun.
In a way. I mean, there's so much to unpack in this series of short stories, so we won't necessarily be able to cover everything, but I encourage everyone to read all 10 of these great short stories. And the birthday treat's another short story I think I mentioned earlier that I think it'd be good to touch upon and talk about in slightly greater depth. It's a story about two young men who meet in their final year at Blundell's school, James Lamble and Desmond Wiley Stife. James Lamble, the son of a colonel, comes from a much more sheltered background, and he meets Desmond, this absolute enigma, this bit of a rebel, and has been expelled from Eton. It delves into the themes of coming of age and friendship, among others. And where did the premise for this story come from, and how did you seek to develop it?
Well, it's 80% true. I mean, it is. I mean, I did know someone who did go to Blundell's. I knew him very well. And I knew a chap like David Wiley Stiff on Jura very well indeed. I won't mention his name because he'd be quite well known. But his family weren't in wine, but they were in breweries. They brewed beer in Yorkshire. And he was a wild fellow, but he was a very attractive, amusing man. The family were it had a sister who was called Ruth, had the most wonderful, not red, but beautiful sort of golden red hair. And we used to see them, we met them, and when I went, used to go to the island of Jura, which is a wonderful island, at least it was then, you know, with a completely, its own ecology. It had, you know, quite different from the island across the water, but only about 100 yards across the island, Sound of Jura was an island called Island. But Jura had its own ecology, its own birds, its own, even had white hares, and extraordinary, lovely, lovely place. It had about 5,000 head of stag and deer, and only about, well, I don't know, 150 people. And this character and his sister, this character was wild. He used to go shooting geese, and he used to do, I mean, all sorts of things. And I can just see him poaching those fish, you know. And he was a definite character. I had him very much in my mind. He'd be very surprised to hear it, but I did, and he made a big impression on me. And so those are really quite true stories, really. I put the one of the characters as the son of an army officer. It was well cast. The chap in reality was the son of a very of the factor of a very big estate belonging to the Sir John Amory, Knight's Hayes estate. And he was a lovely man, but very strict. Not strict, he was very fairly strict, very restrained. And so he was the background for that. So, but they're complete opposites, you know. But they somehow got on. And they have this bonding evening where the good boy invites the bad boy, or if you like, to stay the night and do a bit of pigeon shooting, and they get very close in the dark there, and they sing Scottish songs, and it's actually quite a moving moment, and that transforms the relationship really, and that's what's maintained, and that's what they meet each other for 50 years later. Oh, no, not 50 years, on their 50th birthday. Sorry.
Yes. It's the fascinating thing about friendship, I guess. It knows no bounds, and it crosses all of those expectations and, you know, expectations, which, of course, as you say, are very easily broken.
Yes.
The more more experience one has. I guess
I think in friendship, it's when you get a moment with somebody, when you're both together in the same moment of absolute stillness, just for a second, it's a sort of feeling of love without desire, if you have any idea what I mean. When you get those moments, those are moments of eternity, and so they never disappear. No. And I had that for Paul. He went. I didn't see much of him after that, obviously. But those are the golden moments. Those are the moments. Everyone knows when they've had one.
Yes, and certainly, I think a great deal of readers can relate to that. Moving on to a very different kind of story, so much more humorous, much more of the humorous context, may I say. Actually, in fact, I think all of them are quite humorous in one way, or most of them are quite humorous in one way or another. The bottom line. So it's.
I was wondering if you would ask me about that.
It's a story that I think many readers will find quite inspiring, because there's an element of some Tom Brown school days in there. Of course, we mentioned rugby and Harry Flashman. Every school has its Flashman, so on and so forth. And I think it's a story of resolve and reflection, really, and one of persistence and running against the odds. And
yes, it is.
And an added stroke of luck, of course, and making it. It's a humorous short story that manages to pack so much into a few pages. So what was
it's about bullying, you see. I mean, I know it's the Flashman thing, but it's peer group bullying in another form, you know. And this is a very good school, incidentally, the school in Clitheroe. the sixth form grammar school, the Royal Grammar School, very good school indeed. But every good school, I mean, has a bully. I mean, my poor brother suffered from a bully when I went to my house in Harrow. He'd been bullied for a long time. This particular bully came to my room one night. Anyway, I won't go into it, but it was very easy to deal with him. Ridicule was always much better than fists. And everyone has to meet their bully. I mean, you can't go through life without this happening to you. People will turn on you for all sorts of reasons. In this case, it was he was an ego-ridden sort of inadequate prefect. But the hero has got this unfortunate name, which I don't reveal to the end. I won't mention it now. But he gets teased like hell for his name, and many boys are. They try it on. I mean, I had prep school. They tried to tease me because I had a Dutch name. And, you know, I saw pathetic, isn't it? You know, but everyone has to face these things. You know, don't be intimidated. You know, go up to the bully, face it, go close, right up there. And it's amazing that two things happen. First of all, you find the inner calm to do it. And secondly, the bully gets smaller. And, you know, that's really important, because facing things is half the battle in life. It's not being frightened. The only thing you need to worry about is fear. Who is it said that? Roosevelt, did he say?
Roosevelt in his inauguration, I believe.
And that's what this chap does. And of course, he's a great character because he finds himself, he enjoys himself. He's not frightened of anything, and he takes opportunities because he's not frightened. People don't take opportunities, very largely, because they think, "Oh gosh, I don't think I could do that. That's out of my range," or I better talk. You know, and it's that feeling, thinking about yourself, that creates fear and doubt. You know, this is a story about mastering bully and acting without doubt, and it all ends up. It's very amusing. I won't describe the fun I had describing his revenge. I've just loved writing that. Absolutely loved it.
Yes, I found it amusing through and through. In the beginning, well, maybe not so much beginning, but certainly the middle and the end.
Yes. And they ask him what happened. It was very funny.
Yes,
it's very funny when you like reading your own stories.
The revelations at the end are surprising, but I don't know why I'm not so. I didn't know why I was not so surprised.
Dear, oh dear. I mean, I'm not sure that the old boys of the sixth form college at Clitheroe would appreciate it very much, but I think there's a sense of humor with it.
Maybe there's some relatability there. Who knows? Pupa is a very different kind of story, I guess. From the bottom,
Oh, yes.
and it takes an arguably more somber tone, but at the end, the revelations and of course the questions, the soul searching that takes place, eventually it is very revealing. It discusses the story of a court reporter who publishes a story, slightly sensationalist story, on hearing this news of an eviction, and he's only to be told much more than he bargained for initially. And I guess with that in mind, do you think there's a danger in making surface assumptions in society? And is this a sort of warning to those who might be more prone to assume things at first glance?
That's a very good question again. Sorry to keep saying that. Yes, that's what the whole story is about, really. It's about the curse of classification. You know, as soon as you classify someone, you can do anything to them. That's the secret. You can even end up exterminating them because you classify them. You classify them as Jews, Catholics, Protestants, transgender, capitalists. and so on. And once you've got them in a class, Marx understood this very, very well. Once you've got them in a class, then the actual reality of the individual disappears altogether. And that's why it's so terribly dangerous, and it's the curse of the modern age. And Marx depended on it, and it was his instrument of persuasion. He moved very quickly from contemplating the reality of suffering and exploitation as it was to an explanation in terms of class. And once you've done that, every member of the class can be treated with the contempt that the description allows. And that leads, to Pol Pot. All farmers, I don't know, all intellectuals, take a pick. And I'm not exaggerating. This is what happens. People are thinking. And so what they do is they lose the truth and substitute for it a cult, something overlaid. It's a kind of superstition, what is laid over the reality. And with this story, it's classic. Here's a court reporter, a young one, and he has a case of an old lady being evicted from an old property. And immediately he falls into the trap of seeing this as a class of landlord exploitation. But it's, as the story explains, the landlord actually is a very humane man who has another life as a lepidopterist. That part of it is completely true. And is a man of immense goodwill and generosity who gives anonymously and who was educating a neighbor's child at a public school without telling anybody, except for the parents.
It's almost to show that people...
That was a true story.
Well,
sorry.
It was a true story.
That part of it was completely true. Well, also the eviction too, because he's untrue, because he'd arranged. Well, I mustn't spoil the story, but it was 90% true, that story.
I guess it really comes to show that people are more three-dimensional than a lot come to expect.
Oh.
And there's a lot more. There's another side to a person, particularly after one is more prone to label or stereotype them. And I think this does a great deal of work to send that message out there, to say that read and try and understand before we make any decisions or we make any judgment calls. And
it's very dangerous to criticize other people, but to avoid it altogether. And sometimes criticism of conduct is necessary, but not in order to justify your offense. I mean, that's being offended and so on. It's a very dangerous game, because all you're doing is protecting your picture of yourself. But you mustn't classify people, because that's the worst curse you can ever do. It's terrible, because that's just a mental thing. People say, "Oh, well, you're a climate denier. Oh, so you must be burnt at the stake." Yeah.
Of course, there's much more to the story than one or two words, or more than the phrase.
Yes. Yes. It's supposed to be an unpeeling away of preconception, which is another word for prejudice, prejudging, and revealing what can't be defined, the character and quality of a human being.
And I guess on that note, another story, Berries, it takes a similarly somber tone, and it does talk about someone who who refuses to be labeled, and he refuses to work with the crowd. He refuses to be part of the crowd, and he's an eccentric who works away from the herd. So
it's true, but he's abandoned by his parents in a way. This is also a true story, actually. It was I got to know about it through a client, and he was abandoned. He was sent back from India when he was 4 years old. And he was then educated by an aunt. His aunt looked after him until he was about 12, I think, and his parents came back from India. But he was in boarding school all that time, and he never really couldn't cope with that. He'd lost his mother. You see, he was orphaned in effect by his living parents, and so that is a story also. It's a very intense story, but it's full of hope. I mean, he ends up, he has a habit of wearing women's clothes, but he doesn't do that because he's a transgender or he's a transvestite or anything like that. He does it because it makes him feel comfortable. And it's perfectly obvious that it's because his mother just disappeared when he was 3 and 4 years old. And the lady who looks after him, who's actually just his cleaner, who's the most wonderful woman, turns out to be. She doesn't mind a bit. But I thought I'd lift the lid on that, because there are many men who, falling short of being a transgender or the rest of it, long for the comfort of mother and find it difficult to play the game of being a male. And this must be more common than people are prepared to admit. And it should be understood. It shouldn't be condemned. It shouldn't be reviled. It should be understood. It's quite difficult being a man. You know, you think of yourself as the bow wave flying through the waves of life. And you know, it's not like that. It's hard, sometimes very hard, and dark, and confusing, particularly confusing.
So
and I wanted to illuminate that. All comes well because of the love of his cleaner.
Yes. It's almost to say that really we shouldn't, society shouldn't stigmatize people, because there's more to everyone's background and everyone's life story than what we can assume, what we can expect. And certainly
it's the same thing.
Yes.
As soon as you put something like that in a class and call them a transvestite, well, what hope is there?
Yeah.
Useless point. Just a classification. Just useless. You know, here's this man, and obviously a very loving man, but crippled by his youth, by his early life, and brought to redemption by a cleaner. And he dies, and this is absolutely true, he dies of most awful bowel cancer. And she comes into, I'll just mention this, there's one scene when he comes in and he's got excrement over his entire body. And he's just utterly helpless. And she copes with him. And he ends up in a hospice, but he ends up completely restored, redeemed, smiling, holding a bunch of, I don't know, beech twigs, because he is a great naturalist. You can't see them because you're dying, you lose your sight, but don't lose your hearing. Holding these beech trees and knowing that she was there. And there's a great consolation to that. All that suffering was worth it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
It came about, he was blessed. And so it is, really. We should dwell on these moments because they're so comforting in a deep sense. There's nothing to fear.
Certainly, and I think a lot of readers will agree that there's a bitter. Readers will realize it's a bittersweet ending, and that it shows that there's much to cherish in life, and whatever's happened.
It's not even comparative. It's that the sun really is always shining. It's just there are clouds. It's simple. You have to keep life very, 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 very simple. It's easy when you're 81. It gets easier. That's the joy of being my age. I'd far rather be 81 than 21. Far rather.
I think I'm closer to the latter eight than the former.
I know.
I think I'm clearly obvious. I I move on to one of the last stories we're going to have a look at. What's the point, which you also referenced earlier.
Yeah, that's not such an easy story. No.
No,
Yes.
no. And it takes a very different approach, but it still reflects on the idea of a character's lifetime of work, and certainly a very long-lasting friendship. In this case, it's the life of Guy Pawn. And you focus on the friendship between the two men who originally meet at prep school. And
Yes.
my question is, what message do you seek to send it about lifelong friendship and the timeless bonds it ends up creating?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that early youth, I mean very early youth, from say 4 or 5 onwards, is terribly important in formation of emotional, what's the word, context. Terribly important, and goes on, it does go on for life in certain circumstances. I certainly had that with Paul. I've had it recently with an old friend I was at prep school with, and I remember him very, very well. I never kept up with him, but when you're close to someone, really close, in a dormitory, in the confined circumstances of a boarding preparatory school, and you start to admire someone, and you see their qualities, that forms you, and it, that goes on for life. And when you resume 50 or 60 years later, that's still there. It's extraordinary. So I think that early part of life is immensely important, tremendously important. And of course, in What's the Point, the hero, what's he called, Bourne, he's modelled on a chap I did actually know at prep school called Bourne. He was a very powerful fellow, but lasting around the place. And those things that the skating scene, that actually, I mean, we did have fantastic skating on the lake at my prep school in 1952, because for those who've read my books on climate change, well, there it's very, very cold. Anyway, just a blast through life, banging into everything, You're not impressed by status or class or anything like that. But he misses a few tricks by trying to grab everything and have everything. He invents a fishing rod, I'll just say this one thing, which removes the need for casting a fly. You kind of have a device and you pull a trigger or something, and it sends the fly out automatically. The fly is, of course, covered in silicone, so it never sinks. And it's a fail-safe way of catching trout, but because it misses the whole thing, misses the point. And it's only through suffering when he loses his business, and he has illness, I forget what it is, that he comes around and realizes that there's a wonderful balance between taking part, which you must, and not claiming. And he sort of, the last few sentences in the book are very confusing, because he's confused. The point is that there's no point. He's trying to say that you've just got to do it, but there's no point doing it. And yet there is a point. And that's the point. But it's quite a story for that reason, I think. There's a wonderful scene for fishermen when he's got this enormous lure. He's chucked out on the lake at Blagdon. A trout. He hooks a seagull, an enormous blackback. Their wings are 5 foot wide, and he's fighting with this seagull. That's typical Bourne, Whereas the other fellow, his friend, is delicately casting a fly in the darkening sky, and the sun's gone into a sort of livid yellow, and the storm is starting, and this big gull is flapping around, and this other chap's got this little fly. It's a lovely balance between the two.
He sounds like never the renegade.
It's a wonderful contrast.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I think they're very nice stories. I don't think there's any market for them. People aren't interested in that.
Well, we'll have to see, and we hope that the viewers watching here will see.
I hope so. I hope so. I do hope so. They were written to convey a sense of great optimism and confidence and reassurance. Absolution, if you like. Yes, absolution. And a blessing, to be a blessing to those who read them.
Yes,
Yes, I sound like an evensong priest, don't I?
perhaps. Maybe that's the voice that people need these days. Who knows? And Jeremy, it's been terrific speaking to you about nuts in May. Well, thank you very much for speaking to us.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of talking about it. It was most kind.
It's been a pleasure reading it. Thank you.
Thank you.